Hello and welcome to Identerati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 51, Digital Insanity, the Flexibility of NIST Digital Identity Assurance Levels. And our guest today is Dr. Ken Myers, Principal Identity Architect at the Federal Reserve Board. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Go ahead.
And our co-host today is Tom Clancy, Principal Identity, Credential, and Access Management Engineer at MITRE. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's good to see you again, Ken.
So, Ken, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? How does one become a doctor identity?
Yeah, no problem. Actually, I like to say my career started in the Marine Corps. I was an active duty Marine for about 9 years. Not quite as cool as Tom there, retiring, but that's really where I cut my teeth in digital identity, more so on the network and physical security side. And then after that, I've been kind of floating in and out in various jobs in the federal government, either as a contractor, as an employee, a little bit of private industry experience there. Really in the last year, I was able to, last 3 or 4 years, I was able to use my GI Bill from the Marine Corps and get a Doctor of Science from Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia, where I was able to focus my research specifically on digital identity. My dissertation was on digital identity competency models. I also did some research on phishing-resistant authenticators, and then the paper, the digital insanity paper, was that also. But I'm just a big fan of digital identity, and that's why I'm here today. It's not really anything work-related, just my own private conversation today.
Right. And Tom, when I met you, you were Colonel Clancy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into identity?
Well, I started out as a tanker in the Army, and at some point along the way, the older guys aren't as welcome in the tank force. I had to figure out something else to do, and I really enjoyed the way that automation and digital services were kind of transforming the way that we did business. One of the areas that was really fascinating for me was working with partners, whether they were from other countries or other agencies or even NGOs and things. They were really important to have those relationships on the battlefield. But we'd struggled mightily with sharing information. Even though we had these great tools, we couldn't talk. And I think that was where the seed was planted for figuring out how to do access control and collaboration in a more meaningful way. And it kind of started to redefine the way that I was getting posted in jobs, and it's put me on a trajectory that's lasted beyond retirement. So I hope we can continue to make some great progress on enabling those important relationships.
Cool. Well, I wanted to start today with the topic is we're going to be talking about NIST 863 and digital identity standards. But I was wondering, Ken, our audience might not all be experts on federal government identity standards. Maybe you could give us an overview of 863 and the recent sort of split of it into different categories.
Yeah, no problem, Mike. So if you're not familiar with NIST, stands for the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It is a U.S. federal government agency focused on standards development and measurements. If you ever go to their headquarters in Maryland, it's really kind of impressive the amount of different types of measurement devices they have. I always find it kind of interesting. But specifically with 863, it's in its third revision, and really one of the defining characteristics between the second edition and this third edition that was published, I think, in the end of 2017, 2018, is that it divided the different kind of cardinal factors of authentication between those 3 levels you see there. So it separated out identity proofing as its own distinct security category from authentication and lifecycle management from federation. So some of the advantages in this approach is that you can now mix and match those different categories. If you're not concerned about authentication, you're concerned about risk from an identity proofing perspective, then you can just do an assessment on that, identify your controls. Where in the previous version, the first and second editions, it was all just one. What your risk level was aligned with what kind of authenticator you had to use, and there really wasn't any flexibility in that. And that flexibility is kind of what drove me into publishing that paper that I think we'll talk about a little bit later.
Okay, let me, Ken, if I could just ask you a quick follow-up question on, we're talking about risk management in general. Why is digital identity risk management sort of a new area in the risk management field at large?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say specifically in the federal government, it doesn't seem to be a very new field. Actually, in 2004, there was a policy that was published, Memo 040404 from the Office of Management and Budget. And that's actually, I would say, what kind of set the stage for risk management in the federal government. In doing some academic research, I couldn't necessarily find anything on the academic side, like digital identity risk management that happens either in industry or academia. At the same time, how that usually works is you search by terms, and so you could be using the wrong terms. But I'll say kind of the setting for this starts in that kind of late 1990s to early 2000s. They're called levels of assurance. There are 4 levels of insurance. And then I'll say the thing that turned me on to digital identity risk management specifically within the last couple of years, I focus more on the governance and program management side, although I still I like to nerd out on things sometimes. But there's always the question in my mind when I'm talking to different organizations and they say, we need to use phishing resistant, we need to do this process in person. I'd always ask, why, what's telling you need to do that? You say you have to have authenticator assurance level 3. What is informing your decision that you need to do that? And so that's what led me to dive a little bit deeper into what digital identity risk management is, what's the process to come to a distinct assurance level. I mean, Tom, I don't know if you've had a similar journey there.
Yeah, and maybe Tom, we could pivot to this. How does risk management or identity risk management sort of align with zero trust? Because this is another major trend, I think, in the federal space.
Yeah, I think the way that to kind of go important hook back to what Ken just said, that risk management framework and the newer cybersecurity framework are really the way that we make sure that systems are secure when they come out of the system development lifecycle or in some sort of agile structure where there's product coming out, right? Those controls and setting the controls so they have the right assurance on them is really how we make sure that programmatically we're delivering secure systems. So the digital identity risk assessment kind of identifies what the control needs to look like in that implementation so that it's defensible when you're looking for an authorization for your package. Now, zero trust is kind of taking that process and anticipating that it needs to be more dynamic, right? We're focusing very acutely on what is the access at a protect surface, which sounds a little bit like a policy enforcement point. Where are we getting different signals from in terms of, is there more context to this? Why should I trust this particular access request and permit this transaction? And I think the way that Ken is describing these different levels of assurance, particularly around authentication right now, those are inputs to this trustworthiness that goes into an authorization for a transaction.
That's actually a really interesting way to think about it. Just to repeat back, maybe in a different way, is so the assurance levels is sort of like a snapshot, but zero trust is more like a moving continuum of as I go to these different contexts or as I do different things online, the assurance level might change based upon the requirements of what. So the zero trust is more almost temporal. Is that right? I get that right?
I think so. It's we really look to authentication to be kind of deterministic, right? We really heavily rely on cryptography there and sort of provably matching a private key in a lot of cases when we need some high assurance. And when we look at zero trust, we're considering a whole lot of factors that don't necessarily fit into a very tidy sort of authentication flow. Ken, does that reconcile with your research?
Yeah, pretty well. I would say from a DIRA process perspective, like if you look at NIST 863-3 as the base volume, the base volume is all about risk management. It goes into what is risk management, how you document that in a digital identity acceptance statement or a DIAS. And the term digital identity risk acceptance or digital identity risk assessment, I really think came from, there is a DIRA, that's the acronym. I'm going to try not to use acronyms too much here, but I might throw a couple out.
Thank you.
Yeah, so DIRA, the DIRA process is really kind of defined, and there's the GSA playbook or a federal identity credential and access management playbook. That's on idmanagement.gov. And that was actually a working group. I think they published it right after 863, maybe in the 2020 timeframe. And it was really much more of a explainable process of how to do a risk assessment that wasn't necessarily kind of clarified in 863, which is totally fine, right? Standards are developed for a specific reason. You need some flexibility. You need to be specific in some places. And then when you're testing areas as well, you don't want it to be too specific in the areas that you're relatively unsure about. And so I think the authors of the third revision did a fantastic job of leaving some flexibility in the assessment process. But if you look at the DIRA playbook, I'm sorry, I have some canaries in the background here. So if you look at the DIRA playbook, it kind of outlines 4 major steps. And the first one is doing like an application assessment. What are our users doing on the application? How can we categorize these users into specific types of groups? And so they're called communities of users. So you have like public users, so these would be kind of non-organizational users. You may have employees, and there's different types of employees. You may have general employees. There's IT privilege, and then you may have business users. Think of managers, someone with a little bit higher privilege than a general user. So you think of the employees that are approving access. They're approving maybe financial transactions. They could be posting things on social media that would have some type of immediate impact, both on your data, kind of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or maybe even on the goodwill of your organization, whether that is goodwill from a financial sense, like in a stock price, or goodwill in a data sense. Like if you share data, you share information.
I wonder
how
actually
well it can be trusted.
if I could share the harms, because I think what you're getting at is that depending upon the transactions, there's different potential harms that could occur. And let's see if I can get this one. I was kind of laughing because something new always happens on Identerati office hours, and today it's canaries. So
yeah, I kind of moved them to the other side of the house, but they are.
It's funny. I was like, "Oh, you're outside," but now actually you answered the question for me.
Yeah.
I'm a bird lover myself. I have pigeons, as you'll see at the end, but so I completely understand. But but getting back to the topic, so in your paper you talked about the 6 potential harms as a way to assess the appropriate level of assurance needed, and I thought these were useful, I'm putting them up so I don't put you on the spot and so you won't forget one, but maybe you could just walk us through the potential harms here that maybe we should be thinking about when we're figuring out what's the right assurance level for this this application.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot, I'll say one thing I used in writing my paper was I developed a very basic tool for trying to implement both an assessment of these harms and to some extent following the flowcharts that are in 863. If you've read the draft of the 4th revision, 863-4, they've removed those flowcharts. It seems to be a little contentious with some people, but in developing standards like that, you can't keep everyone happy. So I understand why they removed them. But yes, I mean, looking at these harms, they're in the current 863 right now, and at least in the way that I've approached this is from the context of what is the potential for harm in each one of these 6 categories if this community of user account is compromised. So if we think about it from the perspective of someone logging into Amazon, like a customer logging into Amazon, a veteran logging into the VA, kind of that me as an individual logging into my bank account, what is the potential for harm if my individual account is compromised? So inconvenience or stress both to the organization and to some extent to the individual as well. The individual is a little bit hard, but if my individual account is compromised, what is the inconvenience on the organization? Could it be a little extra help desk? Is it scale or volume? Is it some massive type of breach that a lot of accounts are being compromised? And you kind of walk through that risk assessment or that harm category across each of those types of communities of users. So your public users, your general users, and then the really risky types, your IT privileged, and then your business users as well. So usually those IT privileged, those are your kind of wildcard administrators, network administrator, global administrator, super administrator, super user. Those are the types that usually have the greatest impact on that CIA, that confidentiality, integrity, or availability. But you can do it that way. I mean, that's a little bit more of a fine grain, a little bit more a process involved to think about it from that perspective. A shortcut route would be just categorizing all users. I think we can kind of see where the problem would come in if you're trying to just do one risk assessment over one general group, like bundling all the users into one. And so it is my recommendation to break them down at least in those 4 categories, because each have their own types of processes and types of authenticators that they might need.
And Tom, we love to talk about concepts and flowcharts as Identerati, but then this meets like the real world. And I'm wondering who in an organization would actually be tasked with undertaking this type of risk assessment, and what's the actual adoption? You know, it's one thing for NIST to say, here's some good ideas for you, and it's another thing for organizations within the government and even private sector to actually adopt it. So maybe you can just give us some ideas of like how this actually meets with the real world.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think Ken might have some better insight into adoption and use. I do think a lot of the folks who oversee the risk management cybersecurity framework process, are eager for ways to make control, definition, and measurement more concrete. And this seems like a kind of a huge gift to sort of moving the art of the possible along and providing some standardization that then can be used in conjunction with identity standards to really kind of focus and help align application and services. I think an important thing that Ken was talking about is, we tend to think about FISMA systems as one, monolithic entity, when there's really several different services that system would expose. And each one of them likely has a completely different risk profile if you're applying a digital identity risk assessment to it. You've got the privileged user side, you've got the workforce side, and then you might have a beneficiary facing side. I mean, notionally, that's about as simple as you might be able to get for a federal system. And that's 3 different sort of areas. And then if you have different people doing different types of transactions.
You could say it roles.
What's that?
They said you can say it, 3 different roles. It's almost like you're beating around the bush and you don't want to say roles.
Or persona, I mean, there's a lot of different complexity potentially just in one system, or if you want to break it down to transaction, you might have a completely different granularity there. So I'm not sure to what extent we've really been maximizing the utility of the process and the outcomes.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because this once this meets the real world, it's not only one application like Tom's saying, but like you might have privileged access or super users in that, and then I'm also wondering, Ken, if you could maybe talk about some of the challenges. What do the implementers actually find in the challenges it's easy enough to say what these assurance levels are, but how do you actually figure out if you're in one of those categories? So what are maybe some of who is doing this, and what are some of the challenges around it in the real world?
Yeah, I would definitely say one of the challenges is part of the risk assessment process is that you're identifying your existing tools or maybe even current tools you're using right now. So that means you need to do one of those assurance level assessments on what you're doing right now. And unless you're extremely familiar with how to apply those levels, that's definitely a challenge. And so one of the things that what I did at the General Services Administration, we did a lot of outreach to organizations. We would try to like train the trainer type of situation, and making sure, or at least highly recommending, that someone familiar with the process, familiar with how digital identity assessments and the assurance levels worked, was helping that application owner determine it appropriately. I saw some organizations that just said, well, you know what? We're just going to pick the highest level. We're going to require in-person proofing, PKI-based authentication, and then we're just going to, apply that to all of our applications, which is completely fine. I mean, it's all about your own risk tolerance. And there's some that, we're going to do this on a per app basis and be a little bit more flexible, maybe add in a little more user experience into it, so we don't have to require someone being on a specific type of device using a specific authenticator all the time. And that's fine too. Like, one of the great things about 863 is that it provides that type of flexibility in there based on whatever your risk appetite is.
Go ahead, Tom, please.
Yeah, Ken, I think that's what you just said is huge, right? I think a lot of folks looking at system access will think, well, we'll just use PIV, right? Because it's right across the bar, right? It's the highest assurance for proofing, for authentication, let's do it, right? And then I don't have to, it's simple for me. And I think, that availability angle, and armed with a need for availability, and then a flexibility to provide a look that starts at a baseline of assurance requirement. You can find a lot of opportunities to not go down the waiver exception to policy track, but to find a solution that's going to work and move out, knowing that you have an expectation for assurance that you've met concretely and provably with your services that you define, and you're not doing a bunch of paperwork. I think one of the real problems with using an exception basis and starting with PIV as an assumption is that you don't know what the alternative is going to be, right? You've missed the opportunity to define relevant assurance capabilities to apply. Instead, you just say, well, it's a username password waiver, and then you've got the lowest common denominator, and I think that's really the problem that we need to address with DIRA. And I think Ken has really led the way on making some progress on that part of the conversation.
You reminded me of a conversation we had maybe a couple of years ago about the first job that Glue did for the Navy. The goal wasn't high assurance authenticators, it was low assurance authenticators. They knew how to do PIV, and there was a playbook for that, but they had a training site that had third parties that needed something less than PIV, and they had no playbook for that. And so the answer isn't always use the highest level of authentication, because there are usability and accessibility issues where that approach might not be the best approach. If I could, I'd actually like to show another. I normally don't show that many diagrams, but I wanted to actually show another one today. There's a table that I liked that showed, here we go. It showed basically, it lines up sort of the harms, and then you can look at this and say, well, based upon these harms, here's maybe the appropriate level of assurance, or I guess this is how you might do an assessment yourself to figure out what's the right level. But I like this diagram also because we tend to think about the MFA credentials themselves as being the level of assurance, but this diagram sort of teases out that the new way of looking at levels of assurance has three different vectors to look at: the identity onboarding part, the authenticator part, and then the federation part. And all three of those need to happen. But Ken, maybe you could talk a little bit about how this can help you, how this kind of approach can help you get a more nuanced version of picking the right level of assurance for your app.
Yeah, so this came out of a paper I wrote, I think early 2023, I think February. I actually got it published. It's an academic paper at the International Conference for Cyber Warfare in Cybersecurity. And the premise of the paper had three research questions I want to answer. The first research question was, does dissecting digital identity into these specific components make an assessment more flexible? In other words, is there flexibility both across the levels as well as kind of horizontally? And I'll explain that in a minute. The second research question, more focused on MFA in general. Should all transaction use at least MFA, some form of MFA? The third question was, should transaction use phishing resistant MFA? So a little nuance on the MFA question. So also in my paper, I did a literature review. So I looked at all the available resources I could find that talked about either NIST 863, digital identity risk management, or anything in between there, including academic resources. So I did find a couple predominantly industry resources like MITRE. MITRE, y'all published about 2 papers, I think, one on identity proofing with some templates and federation stuff there. That was great. NSA has an authenticator assurance level fact sheet that aligns kind of common forms of authentication and like different vendor tools, as well as Microsoft and ForgeRock on the vendor side. And then on the academic side, honestly, I didn't find anything. I couldn't find any independently or peer-reviewed papers that looked at.
Because nobody's studying this.
Right. Yeah. And that's one conclusion to arrive at. I could also be using the wrong terms. Like maybe it's not called digital identity risk management or digital identity risk assessments. Maybe it's called something else. But yeah, that was definitely my conclusion. And that's one of the things that motivated me to publish the paper too. And so what this is, it's not specific to really any application. It was really playing around. Like I said, I made a very simple tool, Excel spreadsheet that put the flowchart logic into it. And you can see here, there's some commonalities across the levels. So if you were going to do an assessment that included all 3 levels, in identity proofing, authenticator, and then federation, based on the risk, there really wasn't that much flexibility across. So you can see if I had a level 3 for identity assurance,
they're all the same actually.
Yeah, exactly. So there wasn't that
except
much
the first one. The first
across.
one you decided the federation level was less needed.
Right. Yeah, I would.
Which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, and the reason why was because PII. Like if you look at and this is the third revision of 863. If you look at the flow chart, federation doesn't count into if PII is involved. Where it is for authenticator, any use of PII, even self-asserted, should require MFA, and same thing on the assurance level side. Although I'm pretty sure IL2 is for proofed. It doesn't do self-asserted PII. But yeah, so there's definitely not as much flexibility across. And honestly, like this led me to another kind of research question. In what use cases, what scenarios would I only look at one component and not be concerned with another? And so based on those 3 questions, you can kind of see it in the chart there. But yeah, there is flexibility choosing which level, but not really across. The second one on MFA, it almost like every single transaction, even if it, required self-asserted PII, like even your email to some extent, depending on how you classify PII, that would require MFA. The phishing resistant was a little bit trickier, and it came down to more of a common sense that on the enterprise side, the risk on for your enterprise users, employees, contractors, 100%. Like phishing resistant MFA should be hopefully the only option. But then on the public identity side, meaning outside non-organizational users accessing to buy something, a benefit, it should at least be an option for them, because you have to kind of meet them at their level, whether that's technology level, understanding level. But those were kind of the three outcomes that came out of that research.
Yeah, unshare. I'm the worst at actually showing the diagrams. I think they specifically make it challenging because it's more of a streaming app than a sharing app. Tom, any thoughts on, in the old days, let's say we just had a couple of levels. Was it LOA 2? Was it LOA 3? Was it LOA 4? And now they've broken it apart. But as Ken's diagram shows, there's no variance in that. Do you think it was a good thing? I think it was a good thing just because conflating them made it conceptually hard. But was it actually effective splitting these into different, guidelines?
Well, I think there's really kind of two important facets to implementing the vectors of trust, right? The orthogonal values of identity, authenticator, and federation assurance together. Those vectors. It's really through services, right? We're introducing that federation element, and we've defined in policy, and very specifically in OMB M2209, the zero trust strategy. To your point about zero trust before, we really need to centralize how those identities are maintained, and then connect access management to those enterprise identities. And if you follow the path, then you have to include that FAL element, and then you have a relying party that's going to consume an assertion that potentially has varying levels of assurance associated with the actual identity and the authentication strength. So this is a really important dimension to this, where you have, if you've defined your requirements, you need to have those requirements explicitly met by your provider. And I think this is an area where I've been really fascinated with how important this is to moving things forward. It's already been sort of grabbed in the FIPS 201-3, the PIV, the newest PIV specification. In Section 7, it talks about federation of PIV, and there's been some iterations on 800-217, the PIV Federation Special Pub from NIST. This is an area where we've got to sort of connect the dots on all of those vectors and figure out how to make them meaningful in a service context. And to finally, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit to get back to your question. This is most important when you're talking about interoperability across boundaries. So whether you're talking about service delivery, that flexibly meets a lot of different needs and with an ecosystem of variable authenticators. And I think the other one is, and I hinted about this in my identity story, right? How do you work with partners, right? If you don't have the exact same solutions, how do you meaningfully allow them to participate in an assurance framework so they can meet the requirements of your relying party on their terms, right? Because we don't know exactly what their programs have. They probably don't have PIV unless they're another agency, and even some agencies are trying to meet those PIV requirements over a longer term. So how do we make sure that the digital identity guidelines are about access to resources and services, right? PIV is about delivering capabilities that would then meet the access requirements for services. They're kind of different. And you've got to kind of start by defining what the assurance requirements are, and then work back from there with all the people who are users. And some of them you don't give them authenticators; they get them from somebody else. So how do we make that work is really important.
Ken, any thoughts, Ken? Or if not, I have another question for you, but I'll let you
Yeah,
respond.
just one real quick. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think that a lack of flexibility across the levels, if you're doing them all the same, is necessarily a bad thing, because it's all based on the risk of that transaction. So honestly, if it was like my bank account and someone's trying to transfer $15,000, I hope my bank requires the highest level of identity proofing. They like the highest level of authenticator, and then federation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's there's. I feel like there's a number of areas of my life which are connecting, because what I'm hearing Tom say is that the value of this is in the applications and the protection of resources, um, so the consumption of the identity is where the value is created. I'm thinking a little bit weirdly about S-bombs and the software supply chain. And about how, in order for the software, the bits to be consumed, in a way, just like identities, they need to be trusted. And it's not just how we created those bits, but also how they are sent. And if there's any breakdowns along the way, so if you put it in a repository and you don't protect it, and the SBOM itself is modified, all bets are off. And so I think what I'm hearing Tom saying is, like, it's not just like getting the right authenticator and the right onboarding process in place, but the third part, the federation, enables us to actually collaborate with partners, because there's a chain of custody and a chain of trust of the transmission of that credential to our application, and that's where the actual value is. So I think it's a really good point. And frankly, I think, okay, granted, I'm a software vendor in the federation area, but I really think that the federation space is somewhat underappreciated. And the challenges and the amount of complexity that goes into how you build a trusted exchange between different domains or different partners is sort of overlooked. We focus too much sometimes on the authenticator and not enough on the trust models and how we work together. Ken, if I could pivot to you in a slightly different question. These guidelines are great for government, and sometimes they're mandated by government. But our Identerati office hours audience also has a lot of enterprise IT professionals. And I'm wondering if there are any lessons here that can be applied, or reasons why non-government IT professionals should look to this risk assessment certification mechanism that you're describing.
Oh yeah, I mean 100%. Like, while NIST special publications are primarily focused towards the U.S. federal government, I mean, they're wrote in some ways to be agnostic, so that they can be used by any industry. So there's not necessarily anything off the top of my head within 863 that is industry specific, minus some requirements that I think they've actually removed in the 4th edition, that a system has to meet a specific risk level, like FISMA low, moderate, high. I think they've removed that in the 4th edition, but that definitely is in the 3rd. So for example, like your credential service provider, if it's AAL2, if it's issuing AAL2 credentials, it should be FISMA moderate. I think they've removed that in the 4th edition. But to answer your question, yes. I mean, honestly, how are these enterprises figuring out what level of authenticator? Are they thinking that just using a one-time PIN or push notification does the job to their highly critical systems? And so from that perspective, you could definitely leverage the DIRA playbook. If you go to idmanage.gov, it's actually a GitHub repository. So if you go to the very bottom of that page, you have an edit this page function. And so if you want to tweak that to fit your own organizational risk tolerance, you can do that. And then it's a fantastic resource. And I think it applies to almost every industry, because every industry has risk to their systems, and how are they figuring out what level of identity proofing, what level of authenticator you use, What do you, I don't know, Tom, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think, I believe that if you look at NIST specification for the DIRA process, it was a great starting point. But the way that GSA, Ken's team at the time, really sort of grew that with direct engagement and contributions from agencies, given their experiences, and really fleshing that out is something that's really valuable. And the DIRA is not the only playbook that's out there. They've got a lot of incredible resources that are tailored, based on the direction, based on the specifications that come out, and then making that accessible to agencies as they fight through actually developing it. And I really love the way that the products are, the product of contributions from providers, and there's no restriction, right? You don't have to have a PIV to go, contribute to that body of knowledge. It really is exceptional. So it's good to start to know what the requirements are in 863, but all those are restated and then built out in the playbook.
And so the playbook is listed in the homework. If you're new to the audience, we have a wiki page for every single episode, and that includes the homework. I also put my 4 takeaways there, and a link to the YouTube afterwards. So if you want a direct link to the DIRA playbook, it's in the homework. And okay, well, I think actually we're hitting last thoughts. So I'm going to give last thoughts to Ken because he's the guest. But Tom, any first last thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like one of the most important parts of this whole conversation is, PIV shouldn't be your agency's, monolithic solution to all these access requirements. It's going to be an incredibly important part of it, but agencies really need to be leveraging that federation mechanism and supporting alternate authenticators, including additional options at AAL3, like the FIDO security keys with a hardware binding. So that you can be flexible from there on how identity fits in there. But DIRA will help you identify places where you can accept additional risk and provide availability options to other, that meet your requirements. I appreciate Ken has really contributed to this area. I think we're a lot better off with his work. Thank you.
I would agree on that. Ken, last thoughts?
Thanks. Actually, I think it's been a great conversation, Mike. You mentioned 2 things that reminded me of other challenges that popped up while organizations were trying to do DIRA. And that is, and Tom, I think you mentioned it too, like a policy versus a policy exception approach. I mean, let's just be practical here. And Mike, I think I shared a meme on LinkedIn, I think the last May 5th, where it was like the Death Star going in, it says zero trust strategy, and it blows up because that's their account recovery. Like, yes, I mean, you may support a primary authenticator, but if your backup is still using a password or some type of social engineering, calling the help desk, let's take a more practical approach to this and not going from a in policy versus a policy exempt perception, but actually kind of maybe widening our baseline or widening our perception of what things can we consider to be supported by our enterprise, or maybe even supported for our customers as well. I think on the second side, just, if you are interested in academic research, if you're, definitely do it. The digital identity space seems to be on the academic side, have very strong niches in different areas. Federation is a huge, especially on the technical side, has very strong academic research there. Now on the trust framework side, I haven't seen a whole lot. On the digital identity risk management side is definitely kind of lacking in that area too. So if you're interested in it, definitely pursue it. If you want to reach out and throw a couple of ideas around, I'd be totally open to that also. And Mike, thank you very much for having me here today.
So thank you guys for being guests. Next week, we have a discussion from Canada, And I have to say, I learned something on every episode, and I definitely learned something on this episode. And I don't even know what the Canada's 103-1 Digital Trust and Identity Certification is yet, but I will know something next week. So that should be a good episode. A lot of people know Tim Buma, and Bonnie will also be from Canada, will be on it. So it should be great. Please follow Identerati Office Hours on LinkedIn. There's a LinkedIn page. It's in the bottom of all of my posts. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. And with that, thank you so much, Ken and Tom, for joining. Thank you, audience. We'll answer chat questions on the LinkedIn page, since I can't get distracted with chat, or I can't hear the guests. But thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next Tuesday.